In this week's learning unit, Henslin takes us on a tour of the topic of socialization and many different theories that are attached to that particular subject. Now, you're going to find that this particular week we talk a lot about some theories and concepts that many of you may have already studied in your psychology classes and perhaps some anthropology classes as well. And so this is one area where I think we find that the different fields of theory about human behavior and motivation and history all kind of combine and have their own perspective on what it's all about. And so socialization really is responding to the question of what is human nature and what causes human nature. And the big debate within this particular subject is the nature versus nurture debate. That is it biology that shapes us and leads to us acting the way we are and doing the things that we do, feeling the things that we feel? Or is it socialization, those things that people do to us and around us and for us, and the things that happen in our environments that shape us into the human beings with perspectives and perceptions that we have? There are different theories or different rather techniques that have been used to kind of sort out this question. They're very classic studies, some of which you may be familiar with, including the use of such things as isolated children, and it isn't the sociologists took children and isolated them and put them in a closet for 15 years and saw what happened. But there have been instances of children who were treated that way in their upbringing that were discovered, and when they were brought into interactions with human beings, the differences between them and other children were compared, and there were also attempts then to kind of help bring them up to speed with where the rest of society and children were. And so these isolated children, including the case of Isabel, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, you can learn things. The question really there was, are you able to learn things later if you're deprived when you're young? And the answer to that is yes, up to a certain point. And my recollection is I think that there were a couple of critical points for learning different things, one being 9 years and another being 13 years of age, I think. There have been studies of institutionalized children. Now, not so much anymore, but 50 years ago, still, maybe, 50 years ago, children who lost their family or their parents for whatever reason, whether they were orphans or they were taken from their families for different reasons, or they were just given up because they weren't wanted, largely were placed in larger institutions and were raised in these institutions, and so these were large group homes for kids. And the individuals that have looked at this topic, we're going to those institutions and comparing their socialization, the way those children interacted with others, with the socialization of kids that have grown up in individual homes. And there were some very interesting kinds of differences also observed among institutionalist children. The question there being, how much does that difference, does that human interaction make in our socialization? And the answer to that is, in short, is that it makes a great deal of difference. And in fact, children who grew up in institutions, particularly infants who were in institutions, who didn't have the kind of one-on-one attention and the cuddling that an infant normally gets in a relationship with a parent, really lacked many different things, including intellectual capabilities later in life. Other fields of study include those of looking at deprived animals, and some of you are familiar with the Harlow studies about the rhesus monkeys, and the question was it more important to fed or be loved? Was food more important or touch? And there, in very short description, the baby monkeys were separated from their parents and were given the option of a wire monkey, a monkey shaped in a wire with a feeding bottle attached, or a wire monkey covered in cloth without the feeding bottle. And they found that the baby monkeys were more interested in being with the cloth covered monkey instead of the feeding monkey. So it was important that the outcome of that study suggested that really that touch and that interaction, the ability to cuddle and to be comforted, is more important, even more important than being fed. So there's a lot of indication here that, and through these studies, that human interaction really is very key to shaping us to be the individuals that we become. One study that is actually in your reader, but it is not assigned, is an article called Extreme Isolation by Kingsley Davis, and it looks at the nature versus nurture discussion and looking at two cases of children, little girls who were isolated earlier in their lives, those of Anna and Isabel. And Kingsley Davis, the author there, looks at the biogenic, that is the the causes that come from biology and the nature part, versus sociogenic, that is the nurture part, those different factors in social life. And he concludes in that study that the social group may contribute characteristics that we oftentimes attribute to biology. That is, the individuals that are we're raised to, or raised around, raised by, often are the ones that create characteristics in us. And his study also concludes that it is possible to acquire language and cultural skills even after years of extreme isolation. Although again, there is a limit. There is a point where that is no longer the case. And it's an interesting study, and if you're interested in this, I'd encourage you to go ahead and read that on your own. But in sum, the conclusion of, and this shouldn't surprise you being a sociology class, but our conclusion here early on in this discussion is society is the thing that makes us human. There are different theories about how we go about being socialized. And we'll start with a theory by a interactionist sociologist, and this is Cooley. And he developed a theory of what he called the looking glass self. And looking glass, if you imagine looking into a mirror, this is sort of how he sees socialization happening. That it is a three-step process. First, that we imagine how we appear to others. Then we interpret the reactions of others to us as to confirm it or deny what we imagined. And from that, then, we develop a self-concept. Now, it's interesting and important to note that it doesn't say that we actually see how others view us, but rather it says that we interpret their reactions. So what this suggests to us is that our self-concept frequently is based on misperceptions and misunderstandings. It doesn't have to be true. The interpretation we have doesn't necessarily have to be the fact. The important thing is how we interpret their reactions to us. So Cooley's theory is that our self-concept develops out of our interactions with others, and that we imagine it's really based upon how we perceive others to see us, and that our self-concept comes from that. One of the things that's interesting about this, if you really kind of give some thought to this, is that since we develop new relationships and we lose some relationships, gain more, and are constantly kind of changing the people that are around us throughout our lives, that we really never have a stable self-concept, that the socialization is a lifelong process, and that we are continuously involved in the development of the self. I used to always tell my younger students in this class that I know, well, we'll find out later on, one of the stages in development, of course, is adolescence and young adulthood, and the main task for an adolescent is to answer that question, who am I? And I used to say this doesn't reassure you very much if it disturbs you that you're not sure who you are, because this suggests to you that, well, socialization goes on throughout our lives. In fact, I'll add another theorist to this, a psychologist, I believe he was, by the name of Carl Rogers, and I really enjoyed reading Carl Rogers in my young adult years, and in fact found his writings to be something very reassuring to me when I was kind of going through this sense of who am I and where am I going, and really feeling kind of disturbed, as particularly as I was getting ready to graduate from my undergraduate training. My friends seemed to know where they were headed, and I was up in the air. I could do this, I could do that. Well, maybe I should do this, maybe I should do that. Maybe I should go here, maybe I should stay where I am. It was very distressing to me, and Rogers's book was the book that I read was called On Becoming a Person, and very much the same kind of process he talks about. His basic theory was that you're not going to become the person you are fully going to be until you die, because we are always changing, we are always interacting with others, and we are always growing, that our life is naturally motivated in the direction of change and growth, that this is a human characteristic, that we always want to improve ourselves. And so Roger said, who you are is really, the question is, who am I becoming? And you don't have an answer for that until life is over. And so while on the one hand, that might be disturbing to those who want to have an answer to that question. On the other hand, it can be very reassuring to realize that if you're not sure of who you are, well, that's what growth and development's all about. And this goes on throughout our lives. And Cooley, I think, would agree with that. Another interactionist sociologist, Mead, talked about role taking in the socialization process, and he studied children and really specifically looked at such things as play and the role that children's play have in their understanding of the world and developing their cognitive abilities. And Mead believed that children go through three stages in the development of self. The first being imitation, where they just imitate significant others in their lives. Then they go through the play stage, where this would include things like, dressing up in mom and dad's clothes, those kinds of things, kind of taking on those older roles. Sometimes for children, it could girls and boys. I don't want to be sexist there. Doll houses and playing out interactions in doll houses and cars and trucks and those kinds of things. These are all things where kids sort of project themselves into this play and imagine themselves in these roles. It's different from imitation now, because they really have begun to imagine themselves in this role instead of just acting like other people. And then finally, in team games, and you see more of this, I think, in school, once the kids have gone on to school, where they begin to take on multiple roles, not just playing themselves, but also being a part of a team and having connections to other people and having to do things because of that. So Mead really understood development as occurring during those childhood years, the development of the self-concept as occurring during the childhood years. And if my recollection serves me correctly, Mead believed that really this idea of who you are, your self-concept, was pretty well locked in by the time you got to school. And he also talked about the sense of the generalized other, and this was the perception of how people in general, what and how people in general think of us. This another contribution to the self-concept. So here's kind of a graphic about Mead's three stages, where the children move from a sense of self-imitating others to pretending to be others, finally learning to take on multiple roles through organized play. And again, you can see somewhere in your elementary years, really, this process is completed as far as he's concerned. Jean Piaget, I believe, was Swiss and was a theorist who looked at the development of cognitive abilities in children, that is, the capacity to think and how we think. And Piaget developed a four-stage theory in the development of the ability to reason. I will add to this that some more modern theorists have added some other stages, and we'll touch on that at the end here. But the four basic stages here in Piaget's theory are identified in boldface. First, the sensory motor stage, which in general is from 0 to 2 years of age, and during this period of time the child's understanding of the world and cognitive processing of the world is really through direct contact. And these are also the stages when the child is going through potty training and is very focused upon feeding and a lot of, I think, probably highly intense interactions with mother and father in terms of being picked up and held and cuddled and rocked. This is all kind of how the child relates to the world and understands the world, is through senses. And at this point, really, his or her brain isn't really all that active in interpreting things so much as it is just experiencing things through direct contact. somewhere around 2 years of age, the child enters what is called the preoperational stage. And to understand these terms, one of the things that's helpful to know is that when cognitive theorists talk about operations, what they're talking about is mental processes. So an operation is a mental process that goes on in your brain. And in the preoperational stage, this is 2 to 7 years of age, so this is from toddler to elementary years. Children use play to understand the world. Now this kind of blends in a little bit with Mead's theories we were just talking about, but the children begin to understand what Mead would say through role taking, but a lot of their understanding of the world is gained through play and putting themselves in other people's positions and kind of comparing things. So there really isn't the operations, the mental processes that Piaget talks about here aren't really yet going on, and so things are very concrete. They're not abstract, and that's why it's called pre-operational. In fact, so there's a lot of the understanding there continues to be very basic and rudimentary. In somewhere in the elementary years, once schooling has begun, up until latency age at 12, the children enter concrete operational thinking, and this is where there's a beginning of the reasoning begins. And an example of children moving from pre-operational concrete operational stages is it's a really interesting little experiment that the individuals have done, where you take a beaker, a wide bottomed glass container, and a test tube, which of course is a tall and narrow and thin or narrow bottomed glass container, and you fill the test tube with a liquid, and in front of the child then show them the liquid in the test tube and then pour it into the beaker, and ask the child, is this the same amount of water? Now, a pre-operational or a concrete operational child will be able to understand that even though it looks different, and it is because it's moved to a different container, that it still is the same amount of water because he saw the water transfer, she saw the water transfer right in front of him or her. The pre-operational child is going to look at that and see something entirely different and think that the water is now got a different form of different volume because of the fact that it looks different. And so this is an example of some of the mental operations where in concrete operations the children actually can process what's going on and sort of make transfer of knowledge from one to another. So they're beginning to reason, but still reasoning by and large remains very, very concrete, and you cannot this is a mistake I often see parents make with children is they think that children can kind of reason things out and be very logical in elementary years and things like this, and really that's not something yet that kids learn to do. And children in elementary ages, until they have developed their cognitive capacity, some really need a lot of structure for them and a lot of do's and don'ts to help them understand how to negotiate the world, because they yet can't really connect a lot about cause and effect and think independently in those areas. They tend to be very concrete in terms of right and wrong. Everything is very black and white. So children at this stage sometimes don't understand those kind of gray areas where mom or dad might wind up doing something that really isn't exactly the right thing to do, but it's still okay. An 8-year-old child seeing dad come home drunk might think that that's a very, very horrible thing, not realizing and setting aside value judgments about substances and alcohol, not realizing, well, this was daddy's birthday and he and mom went out and celebrated, but mom drove and everything was fine, but that he might think that it's just wrong that daddy was drunk and not understand that or even that he drank at all, not understand that there may be an exception to that general rule that we should stay sober or we shouldn't drink or however it is we want to look at that. So very concrete in this stage, and then it really is the adolescent years before children are able to begin to separate themselves from what they see, sort of to rise above the situation, and this is where we say they develop the ability to think about thinking. That is, they abstract thought becomes a part of their their world, and so they can step back from a situation and look at it, compare reality to the way things should be, for instance, those kinds of things. And so children, especially in the younger years here, tend to be very, very harsh critics. And well, young teenagers in particular, junior high kids, can sometimes be very merciless about their parents and tend to see their parents as hypocrites a lot of times because they preach one thing but do another. I mean, be very, very harsh critics of parents, and catch every little thing they do wrong, and harp on every little mistake, not really yet having that big picture because they've still got sort of a part of their thinking in the concrete stage, but being advanced enough to be able to compare what is to what should be. And so it is really the later stages before that gray area becomes more obvious, I think, and easier to understand. And we can begin to understand that sometimes decisions are made in context. They're not all black and white, but there is times when an individual correctly makes a decision to do something that might in other situations not be appropriate. And so this is where some, I think, later theorists have kind of separated formal operations into early and late stages, because there really is a difference between how a 13-year-old thinks and how a 17 or 18 or 19-year-old thinks. By the time they're older, they're beginning to kind of understand the realities of life in the world and able to sort out what should be with what is, and be comfortable with sometimes the contradictions there. Having worked with children in the field of all ages, one of the things I used to love about working with adolescents was how abstract they could get sometimes, and it was almost like they might come into their treatment sessions with me and sit down and kind of take their thoughts out and separate them and lay them out on a table and move them around and play with them a little bit. It's like anything that's new. You're very fascinated with the use of that new thing, and teenagers a lot of times, especially younger teenagers or middle teenagers, love abstract thought. I mean, it's just a lot of fun to talk with them at that stage, unless you're their dad or mom, and then it's not so much fun sometimes. Sigmund Freud, you all heard about Sigmund Freud, and Freud in a lot of ways is considered to be one of the fathers of psychology and psychiatry, I think. In the 1800s his theories began to develop, and one of the things that's important to understand about Freud is that he grew up in Austria in a period of time when there were a lot of repressions, I think, as to thought and things like this. Things were very proper. It was sort of a Victorian sort of society. Any references to sexuality were repressed, and in fact, I read once that things were so repressed in that society that you may have seen this, concert pianos with curtains around them, that they would put curtains around the bottoms of pianos because the legs seem to represent phallic symbols, and anything that seemed to suggest, sex was something that had to be hidden or covered. Women were in huge dresses and things like that, and so it's probably not too surprising that Freud saw sexuality as sort of being the driving force of one's personality and thinking and world, because, well, you might guess that if it was that repressed, that it would push its way into the consciousness quite a bit. Freud really saw the self, the basic self, established by 5 years of age, even before school age. And we'll talk about his stages of development in a moment, but just also to understand that he saw the personality as developed into 3 parts. That is the id, the superego, and the ego. The id being that part of you that says, okay, just do it. It looks like fun. It'll feel good. Let's do it. Just do it. Don't worry about consequences and just go ahead. That's the instinctual part of us. The superego is sort of like our parent that says, now, is that the correct thing to do? Is that the right thing? Should you be ashamed of yourself for this, or can you be proud of yourself for that? There's sort of that conscience, that voice within us. In fact, he referred to the superego as the culture within us, because he believes most of those messages come not just from mom and dad, but from our culture that gives us. You remember, well, actually, we haven't we haven't done the chapter on culture yet, but you'll learn when we get there that the culture, sets standards of behavior for us. And so he really thought that the superego was the culture, what has, been ingrained in us. The ego is the mediator between the instincts and the conscience. This is the thing that is sort of like, that kind of helps balance these two out. And of course, the suggestion would be here that a healthy individual has a healthy balance of satisfying the id. That doesn't necessarily mean without thinking about consequences, but still, ensuring that there's some pleasure and happiness in life versus, listening to the superego and being responsible and doing the right thing and those kinds of things. So the ego helps to mediate those two. And when it's said that somebody has a healthy ego, that essentially it means that there's a good balance between instincts and conscience. This was updated in the 1960s. There was a theorist by the name of Eric Berne who wrote a book that was extremely popular in the 1960s called "I'm Okay, You're Okay." The phrase became such a catchphrase that many of you younger folks may even be familiar with the phrase. And essentially, Berne, he was into what was called transactional analysis, and I'm not going to go into this deeply, but if you can kind of think about the West Coast and the hippie movement in the 1960s, and this, I think Berne was stationed in San Francisco. I don't know, but there was a big movement there, at least, of kind of just really kind of having group therapy, sitting on the floor and talking with each other and assessing how you affect each other, and the theory oftentimes was how you're impacting me and how I feel about that and how that impacts you and those kinds of things. Berne's theory referred to three parts of the personality as the parent, the adult, and the child. And you can see very clearly here how that relates to Freud's superego, ego, and id. I think that's pretty clear. Now, Freud's stages of psychosexual development, again, he saw the sexual development as sort of being the centerpiece of things, can be separated into 5 separate stages. The focal object of the child's energy defined the 5 main stages of psychological development. In other words, what was the focus of what is going on in that child's life? And in the oral stage, everything 0 to 18 months, everything goes in the mouth. And if you're around little children, there's thumb sucking, and a lot of times babies, one of the things that they do when you reach out to babies is they grab your hand and they pull it towards their mouth. And it isn't just that they think everything's a nipple, or that everything is a source of food, so much as it Freud would say this is how they're learning about the world. Now, you have to be very careful about that, but that's one of the reasons why with little children, you have to be very careful about them ingesting things that are harmful to them and those kinds of things, because they're very used to just grabbing and sticking things in their mouth. So there's a real dependency in this stage. In the anal stage, and this, we're kind of moving into potty training here. The anus becomes sort of the focus in Freud's theory. Elimination becomes a source of fascination. Potty training is the centerpiece of life, and it's really about giving and taking. Self-control. When people refer to individuals being anal, you get the picture of this. They won't. They don't give up anything of themselves. They're very controlled and tight. And so if you've potty trained children and you're sitting there waiting for your little child to produce the product, so you can get them off the potty seat, and sometimes that child is just determined not to do that there. But as soon as he comes off the seat, then he poops his pants or something. That's all about the anal stage, and Freud's takes it beyond that physical process also to say that it's really about what do I give to you, what do I control, what do I keep to myself, those kinds of things. And part of that development of personality is going on there. The phallic stage, the child really kind of discovers his penis, and this is kind of an interesting thing because Freudian theory was very oriented towards males, and Freud saw males as having something that girls didn't, and that's sort of how this theory kind of that the vagina and the clitoris and all these kinds of things that are a part of female biology really wasn't important in Freud's theory because the penis was the thing. And so he believed that both boys and girls were fascinated with the penis. And in fact, girls would experience what he referred to as penis envy, that they wanted to be a boy. And he thought that's one of the reasons why some girls become tomboys and things. But in any event, you get the sense here that the penis is sort of the focus. And this is when little boys in particular can begin to identify themselves as a boy or a girl. And this identification of self. Now, one of the things I want to mention to you, by the way, in the phallic stage, this is very much focused upon the penis, not as so much as a sexual object or a sexual tool, let's say, or whatever the term is we want to use for it. It's not an object of sex so much as it's an object of feeling and something that identifies you. This is a very immature fascination with this. It's not the sexual kinds of things that come later on in adolescence. So there is a difference here in how this is experienced. But during this, you've heard of the Oedipal complex, and this has a lot. I just don't have really the opportunity here to go in depth in this, and nor do I really have the expertise, let's say, to be able to talk about it. But it's an interesting part of this discussion, the Oedipal complex, and the girls have something similar to this that's called the Electra complex, and this is essentially where the little children become very fascinated and fall in love with the parent of the opposite sex. The Oedipus complex is the little boy falling in love with the mother, and I think, according to some hardcore interpretations of this theory, the little boy really wants to go to bed with his mother, and in this phallic phase, somehow knows that the penis has something to do with this, I guess. Big dad, father comes along. He's much bigger in all ways than the boy, and so he's a threat to this little boy, and more to the point, the little boy realizes that he may be a threat. His fascination with his mother may be seen as a threat to his father. Recognizing this, the little boy may develop what's thought of as castration anxiety. That is, he's very afraid that the father, might just cut his little penis and his scrotum off because the father is jealous of him and doesn't want his competition. And so in order to avoid this, the little boy learns to separate himself from his mother, separates himself from the mother, and identifies, perhaps over-identifies with his father. And this is how Freudian theorists believe that the boys make the transfer from the mother. I mean, the children, both males and females, are very attached to their mother as infants and in their toddler stages. They're breastfeeding, and mom is of course this is a very traditional Western kind of theory, you know what I mean? So I understand that. I realize there are variations on this, but mom is the one that's at home raising them and taking care of them. Not so true anymore, but in this particular theory at least. And so they spend a lot more time with mom than with dad. That's probably still true. And boys, though, have a problem when they sort of discover their penis and they realize they've got they're not like their mom. They need to be like their dad, and so they have to make this separation from the mother in order to identify and attach to the father. And when you study male socialization, and I teach a class on men and masculinity from time to time, this is one of those phases where they think this is one of the reasons why men have such complex psyches, is that they've had to go through this trauma of separation from the mother that the girls don't have to go through in order to attain their gender identification. Take that for what it's worth. There may be actually some truth to that, but in any event, I think Freud's interpretation of how this happens and why it happens all around this Oedipal complex and fear of the father, so the identification with the father and thus the adoption of that male the sense of self as a boy really kind of comes from sort of a fear of the father, and it's kind of an interesting interesting process. But again, I would have to tell you this is likely a bastardization of the real theory, and my apologies to any of you who know this theory better, or to anybody who has explained it better than this. But in essence, for the purposes of this discussion, this tells you a little bit about the phallic stage and some of the things that are going on. It isn't a quiet stage at all as far as the personality development is concerned in Freud's theory. But what comes after that, and maybe because everybody's just so exhausted about all this, latency develops, and at 6 years of age, and this is the school age. And Freud's theory was is that children basically don't think a whole lot about sex during this period. Um, with the exposure of the media and things like this, this may also be something that's very different in today's culture. But in any event, in this theory, from about the age of 6 years until the time of puberty, essentially the elementary age, this is a relative calm period of in the personality. There's very little psychosexual conflict. Boys tend to hang with boys, girls hang with girls. Girls have cooties, boys have cooties. Their playground play is very separate. There is an article also in the text, in your reader, by Barry Thorne, I believe it is, about playground, and she called it gender school. We may be reading that later in the semester, but it's a very interesting article if you want to read more about this too. Um, yeah, and so that's the latency age. And somewhere along, and when you look at this, I mean, you realize little girls' parties tend to be mostly little girls at birthday parties, and same with boys. A lot of times they don't invite kids from the other sex, and so you see some of that where there is this separation. But then puberty happens, and that all changes, and awareness of the genitals reemerges, and in a very, very different way, as I referred to earlier. This is a much more mature kind of, and I use that term loosely, a much more mature sort of identification and interest in the genitals for both boys and girls. And, there begins to have some concern about creation and enhancement of them and those kinds of things. And so Freud's theories would suggest that at this stage of development, this is where personality development stops. Once one reaches adulthood, or I'm sorry, once one moves through the period of puberty and begins to relate to the opposite sex as sexual objects, Freud believes that's when the personality has formed. There are many other theories, of course, that contradict that, but this is the basic Freudian theory. Now, I am going to halt this lecture at this stage just because I've talked long enough and it's time for a break. And then, if you would, go ahead and get your cup of coffee and come on back, and I'll give you the second half of this week's lecture.